Like-Minded, a sci-fi audio anthology.
The Others by Robbie Hyne. For much of his early life, Thomas Howell was just your average boy. He was born on August 23, 1968, at 5:42 a.m. to Richard and Jennifer Howell, a carpenter and local real estate agent. He had a sister, Lucy, 2 years his elder, though several times as popular. Their family always lived in the same quaint, all-American home, 124 South Villa Street, in the same small town of Edgewood, Wisconsin, with the same shops and bars and restaurants, the same neighbors, who even for the most part had the same jobs at the factory a few miles down Robertson. Thomas loved army men and trains. He played on the neighborhood swing set, explored the town woods, even building a secret tree fort somewhere far off the beaten path. He was always cared for, rarely hit, and did fine in school. Yes, Thomas was just your average boy. At least, that's how Jennifer Howell liked to remember him. The truth was, Thomas had also been a bit of a loner. But over the years, she began to see the subtle signs of a deeper shift. As he grew older, Thomas's solitude turned into a more profound withdrawal. Where there had once been a glimmer of joy and curiosity behind his eyes, burgeoned a growing shadow. His laughter became a rare and almost distant sound. His interactions with others grew sparse, and his previously mild demeanor turned into something altogether more melancholic. Jennifer's heart ached as she watched these changes unfold. It was as if the boy she had known, the one she birthed, was slowly slipping away, replaced by someone she struggled to recognize. A muted and somber version of that child she remembered. No more the average boy. In his place, a troubled soul whose struggles she felt helpless to mend. But it wasn't just Thomas's struggles that made Jennifer Howell feel more helpless over those years. Edgewood, once a picture of small-town charm, also seemed to be slowly slipping away. Those early signs she had missed, as so many had, until 2 years prior, the factory, the lifeblood of the community, had been forced to close its doors. With that abrupt shutdown, many townspeople lost their jobs, leading to a wave of hardship that rippled through their community. Over the following years, local businesses began to shutter. Townspeople lost their homes. Even the local school, Broad River Elementary, closed. The decision made to consolidate and integrate students from surrounding towns into a county school. Jennifer couldn't help but see the parallels between her son's gradual isolation and the town's decline. Though they were altogether unrelated, both seemed to be succumbing to an unseen force that sapped their vitality. As Edgewood crumbled, so too did Thomas. The more the town fell into disrepair, the more Thomas withdrew. The more weeds sprouted, invaded, and overtook houses and streets, the more Thomas became swallowed and obscured by the weeds within him. The more everything changed, the more Jennifer Howell felt altogether alienated in her own home. Jennifer did try to seek help for her son, but doctor visits were expensive. Specialists were few and far between. And in Edgewood, if it got out that Thomas was partaking in any form of psychotherapy, The family's reputation was sure to be destroyed. With that no doubt in mind, Richard took a far different approach than his wife. Despite her protest, he grew more and more determined to beat it out of the boy. When Thomas wasn't in school, Richard brought him to construction sites across southern Wisconsin to be put to work. He monitored Thomas's television intake, forced him into sports he had no interest in, dug through his backpack every night before bed, every morning thereafter, and lashed out at him several times a week, at least when he was home from his increasingly common work trips. As for Thomas's sister Lucy, well, she continued what she had always done, ignoring him. Nothing seemed to help until they showed up in town. It was the fall of 1984. Thomas had just turned 16 and started back in school. At first, their ingression into Edgewood was almost imperceptible. Here and there, townspeople would report strange men and women standing alone on Main Street, in the parks and neighborhoods, even once out in Mr. Addison's fields. Still, they managed to avoid any unwanted interactions, except maybe once when the incredulous Mrs. Waters cornered one of them in the alleyway behind Ainsworth. But perhaps for the first time in her life, Mrs. Waters' prying questions went completely unanswered. The man simply smiled at her, then walked away. As the cold autumn settled in, a new family arrived in Edgewood, the first in many years. They purchased a home on South Villa Street, just 3 houses down from the Howells. It had been for sale for some time after its foreclosure. The Howells, like most on the block, were immediately thrilled, hoping the property would receive some much-needed tender love and care again. Maybe then it wouldn't be such an eyesore. In that hope, or maybe just naivete, everyone seemed to ignore that this was not Edgewood's average family. There were 4 members of the household, to be sure, but they didn't seem to be at all related. In truth, they were adults of various ages and backgrounds. Not only that, they kept almost completely to themselves, like Thomas, preferring obscurity. They were rarely outside, except, it seemed, for long evening drives around town. They didn't care to their yard, or really do any work on the house that anyone could discern. All in all, the property remained an eyesore. Over the next month, 2 new families bought other properties in town, one on Spring Street and the other on Coldwater, both long vacant, run down and dilapidated. Like with the Villa Street property, these odd family units kept to themselves. They didn't worry about home upkeep. They didn't care to meet their neighbors. By any decent measure, they just simply, at least for the time being, resided there. Most townfolk seemed content, or at the very least, resigned to leave it all be, to let them live the way they wanted. Yet another enduring illustration of just how damaged and exhausted the town's collective psyche had become. It was only Mrs. Waters who first noticed. Members of each household started to come and go for days at a time, often with others taking their place. Every week or so, several old pickup trucks would stop by the houses with boxes of food and supplies, and who knew what else. As if they were stocking up for something bigger still to come. After a rather large delivery when Sheriff Clemens went to visit the Spring Street property one Thursday evening at Mrs. Waters' behest, nobody answered the door. At first, he assumed they weren't home, but as he edged around the side of the yard, he saw quick shadowed movement behind one of the curtains. Someone was home. Someone had been watching him. On another occasion, Clemens was called to the McAllister residence, some blocks down from the purchased Coldwater property. Mrs. McAllister was sure that someone or several someones were stalking through her backyard, watching the family. There was no evidence to back up such wild claims, not even a footprint, but it never sat right with Clemens, especially over the preceding weeks when similar calls started coming into the station, though none bore fruit. It was late November, sometime near Thanksgiving, when Sheriff Clemens got a call from the Waters residence. This wasn't altogether uncommon. Mrs. Waters made a habit of checking in with the sheriff's station several times a month. But as Clemens was in a last-minute meeting with the mayor at the time, he missed the call. Another followed, and another. Clemens resolved to send a deputy to investigate, or at least hear Mrs. Waters out and apologize for missing her calls. But to Clemens' dismay, that deputy reported back later that Mrs. Waters' body had been found slumped in her favorite recliner in her living room, with her beloved cat still curled at her feet. It was December. Thomas was out for an early evening walk. His father, just back from another work trip, had been forcing him to do this after dinner each night that week, despite temperatures often being below zero. It built character and respect, he would say, dismissing his wife's concerns. Thomas didn't know how much character could be built while freezing to death. So he didn't hesitate when only 3 houses down, a beautiful 17-year-old girl named Kaylee stepped outside the dilapidated home and offered him some hot cocoa. It would be hours before Thomas eventually returned home. Hours that Jennifer spent worried, Richard spent annoyed, and Lucy spent indifferent. When Thomas did return, for the first time, he ignored his father's questions and demands, retreating to his room. Richard's annoyance turned to rage, but Jennifer, as so often she'd tried before, played interference, condemning his tactics with Thomas and accusing him of using his increasingly common work trips as an excuse for physical and emotional absence from the town, from their family. Richard countered forcefully that Jennifer had no idea the crushing pressure he was under to keep the family afloat during such tumultuous times. Thomas was beaten that night for his transgression, but mostly for the earful Richard had been taking from his wife during Thomas's time away, and her enduring indignation to come. Thomas expected it. As he was hit, he let his mind drift elsewhere, back to that beautiful girl he'd never met before, to her kindness, welcome, and care, and to all that she had told him. It was only days later that at least some of what Kaylee had confided in Thomas made its way around town. Not because he mentioned it to anyone. On the contrary, he had been careful to keep everything to himself. But because Edgewood was a small town, and the purchase of the abandoned Broad River Elementary was the type of news to spread like wildfire. What was perhaps more surprising was that almost overnight, it seemed, the old school had been brought to life again. Not by students or faculty or staff, but depending on who you asked, the outsiders, the strangers, the others. They descended upon the town with a quickness, began the process of cleaning and refurbishing the school grounds. They put up wire fences and covered those fences with blankets and tarps, thereby sectioning off their new home from the rest of the town. Then their pickup trucks transferred in moving boxes, food, supplies, furniture, and it seemed even more of them. For a while, Thomas watched those happenings from afar, observing the others just as they had observed Edgewood the previous fall. He was by no means the only curious onlooker. A sense of looming anxiety was replacing all resignation through the town. Sheriff Clemens had staked out deputies at several points around the school, tasking those officers with trying to get any sense of what the others were up to. And more than a few townspeople went out of their way to walk, bike, and drive by the old school, even just for a peek if they could manage it. Where Thomas was different from the rest was why he was watching. It was the new year, 1985, when Thomas made his decision. After days of studying the others, watching, walking the perimeter, and even speaking once or twice more with Kaylee, he got dressed early that morning, greeted his family as was expected of him, completed his chores, ate breakfast, then left. Thomas Howell arrived at the new front gate of Broad River just 13 minutes later. Jennifer Howell spent that same Sunday as she almost always did. She gardened, went to the market, played backgammon with her friends, watched a few reruns of Hollywood Squares, and cooked dinner for the family. But when the time came for everyone to gather around the table, Thomas was nowhere to be found. Jennifer played her immediate worry off, afraid of the wrath it might bring down on her son. If she didn't call too much attention to it, she was sure Richard and Lucy would move on with their evenings, none the wiser. And so they did. But when 8 p.m. rolled around, Jennifer's worry turned dire. 8:30 came and went, then 9, then 9:30. At 9:45 p.m., she couldn't take it any longer. Bypassing her husband, who had fallen asleep in front of the TV, Jennifer took the car out to look for her missing son. That night, Sheriff Clemens took Jennifer Howell's call directly. Deputies were dispatched. More calls were made around town. The manhunt for Thomas Howell had begun. It was minutes, hours, days, weeks. Still, there was no sign of Thomas, no evidence of foul play, no indication of where he might have gone. Until almost in passing, a young neighbor boy mentioned to his mother that he'd seen Thomas many weeks before, talking with the pretty girl from the strange Villa Street house. It wasn't that Sheriff Clemens took the kid's words to heart. After all, his deputies had already questioned some of the others. But it did offer him a unique opportunity, an excuse to get a closer look inside Broad River. To his surprise, as he approached the gate that Saturday morning, it was already being pulled open, as if he were expected. An older woman stepped out, flanked by guards with guns and a black and white Springer Spaniel she called Otis. That was Cecilia Torrey, the leader of the others, and a force to be reckoned with. For the time being, though, Cecilia remained altogether inviting in tone and demeanor. She wouldn't let Clemens inside the gate, and he had no real authority to move past her without an official warrant, but she did answer all his questions, assuring him the others had nothing to do with anyone's death or kidnapping. Clemens took his leave a short while later, but before Cecilia moved back inside the gate, she turned to a worn blue sedan parked in the distance, waving to Jennifer Howell, who had been watching anxiously the whole time. From that moment forward, Jennifer was convinced the others had her son. She pleaded with Officer Clemens to find some means of going back, entering the Broad River property. He couldn't. She turned to her husband for help. He wouldn't. What reason could they possibly have to take Thomas? Richard queried, frustration boiling to the surface. Because he was seen talking to one girl? Just admit you're glad to be rid of him, Richard. They didn't speak again for several days. Another week passed without any developments. On the contrary, what remained of the manhunt was dying away. Townspeople had to get back to their lives, at least what was left of them. Deputies had other things to attend to, so much as there were other things going on. But perhaps most truthfully, many were starting to believe, like Richard did, that Thomas had left of his own accord. Even Lucy posited that Thomas might have just been trying to escape the family, the town, and everything he hated about the place, including himself. At the same time, the others began a campaign of community outreach, organizing a local food drive, finally fixing up the homes on South Villa, Spring, and Coldwater, offering to help clean up other public spaces, frequenting Ainsworth and other small businesses on Main Street, even simply presenting themselves as friendly faces around town. Though some, like Jennifer and Sheriff Clemens, saw these tactics for what they were, others overlooked the meticulously orchestrated manipulation. Edgewood was fragile after all, its defenses down, and its townspeople desperate for any promise of renewal. Jennifer remained undeterred. The others were finding their way into Edgewood. If no one else would, she was going to find her way into Broad River. Only she might not need to, as if in answer to that very determination, Richard had been visited at work by none other than Cecilia Torrey herself. The others suddenly needed a contractor to help restore some of the more desperate parts of Broad River's structure. Cecilia had the workers to complete repairs, but she needed an expert to guide them. At first, Richard was ready to outright refuse. He was no fan of these interlopers in Edgewood, whether he believed they had Thomas or not. But in second thinking of his wife and her deteriorating state of being, he decided that agreeing to at least assess the property would be the most apt choice. "How did you know to come to me?" he had asked before Cecilia departed that night. "It's a small town, Mr. Howell." It was exactly 8:15 a.m. the following Tuesday when Richard entered Broad River. He reported back some hours later. No sign of Thomas. No real evidence of anything nefarious to speak of. But he did at least consider Broad River to be very odd. Richard noted that guards were stationed along the fringes of the Broad River grounds, the west side of which had been converted in large part to a garden and greenhouse. On the east side, the courts and playground had been refurbished, but otherwise left unchanged. Just past that, he even got a glimpse of what looked to be a small tent city in the old faculty parking lot. Broad River's interior resembled more of a prison, as Richard described it. Several rooms had been transitioned into makeshift quarters and/or communal spaces. The cafeteria, which needed the greatest amount of repair, served its same purpose. The gym, also in need of repair, seemed like a small self-contained market of sorts. There were cameras being added throughout the old school, patrols down each and every hallway, even a few sections that were off limits. To Richard, of course, but as it seemed, also to some of the others. In the end, under Sheriff Clemens' instruction, Richard agreed to at least draw up plans for Broad River renovations. For the time being, foregoing any further assistance on the property. If it wasn't before, it was now clear what the town of Edgewood was dealing with. A cult. Time was beginning to hold less and less meaning for Jennifer. She marked her days moving through bouts of depression, anxiety, frustration, anger, and desperation. Everything she'd been using thus far to keep herself, at least in some way, grounded, she was abandoning. She refused going into her office, stopped cooking, playing games, cleaning, or gardening, turned away friends at the door, disassociated from her husband and any of his attempts to reassure her, though those had become fewer and further between anyway. Even her daughter, for the first time in her life, was feeling the other side of indifference. Lucy didn't like that one bit. In that same time, things were slowly starting to change even more around Edgewood. Some of the others were moving more freely around town, or at least more confidently. A small, long-abandoned property on Main Street was purchased outright. No renovations to speak of had begun. No one was even seeming to visit it. But speculation grew as to the others' plans for the space. Then there was Mr. Swan, who, after falling unexpectedly ill, was forced to resign from his city council seat, leaving it vacant until a special election could be held. Still, there was no sign of Thomas Howell. Sometimes, Jennifer would find herself sitting outside Broad River for hours at a time, watching the comings and goings. There wasn't much to see. Everything the others did was still shrouded in mystery. But one morning in particular, around 4:30 a.m., Jennifer had walked over when she couldn't sleep. She saw something she did recognize, or rather, someone. A man around her age with dark hair and a charismatic smile who had helped facilitate the purchase of the South Villa Street home 3 doors down from her own. He had disappeared for some time after, only to return some weeks ago to actually stay in the purchased home. That morning, he was in a green pickup driving out through the open gate, listening to an old Patsy Montana song on the radio, paying no mind to the woman he passed within a few feet of, pulling off down the road. Suddenly, time had some meaning again. At least those hours Jennifer could dedicate to stalking the man who she had come to know as Patrick Weiss. It was a noted improvement from standing outside Broad River. Following Patrick around, watching him through windows, and so on, gave Jennifer the sense that she was doing something. Only once or twice did she ever get the impression he might have spotted her following him. But even in those instances, he continued about his day, and she never took pause. Until one late afternoon inside Ainsworth, Patrick rounded an aisle corner, but when Jennifer did the same only a few paces behind, he'd stopped and was staring right at her. "Are you following me?" he asked. Jennifer swallowed hard before realizing that Patrick sounded almost charmed by the idea. "I'm sorry," she found herself saying. I just thought—" She hesitated. Well, where was she going with this? "I thought maybe you might be interested in having an affair." The word slipped out before she knew what she was saying. Patrick's brow furrowed, but not in shock, more curiosity. "That's an odd thing to blurt out," he said after a long moment. Jennifer sought new words, to placate, to pull back, but none escaped her. Patrick came to her rescue. "Perhaps we could start with a friendly drink. Any recommendations around here?" "Connor's," she said with a deep breath but no hesitation. The Midtown, it's called." That evening, Jennifer cleaned the kitchen for the first time in weeks. She paced her garden, pulling weeds, sat for a while, alone at the dining room table. Then, when Richard fell asleep, she stole into her closet, got dressed, and snuck out the front door. Under different circumstances, it might have been exhilarating. Jennifer just wanted to vomit. But she was on a mission, and he was her means to that end. At the Midtown, Jennifer met Patrick in a back booth, as far from prying eyes as was possible. After some initial awkwardness, they began talking of regular things. Their likes and dislikes, where they grew up, their favorite games. For a few moments, Jennifer almost felt normal. But then the conversation turned to children, and she was suddenly thrust back into stark reality. In the next moment, she considered asking Patrick outright about her son. Her gut told her that was the wrong approach. So instead, she told Patrick about Lucy and asked him about his family. He had none to speak of, but he hoped one day he would have a child of his own. For the time being, though, it doesn't seem to be in the cards, he said. Oh, she added questioningly. He took a deep breath, another swig of his beer. Well, he started, puffing his chest with some pride. I shouldn't tell you this, but I've been asked to run for the open city council seat. Jennifer's heart sank so deep she thought she was lucky to still be breathing. She recovered quickly, forcing a smile. That's wonderful. Patrick clocked her hesitation. She knew that. All she could do was try to ignore it, forging ahead. Best of luck to you, then. That was it, though. Vomit was churning up inside her again. Catching Patrick quite off guard, she thanked him for the drinks, then excused herself, reassuring him that they would see one another again, before hurrying away. Outside, Jennifer moved to the safety and darkness of the alleyway before throwing up what felt like everything inside her. She spit, catching her breath. And that's when she heard it. Wait, came Patrick's voice from behind her. So that was it then. The others weren't just hoping to call Broad River home. They were trying to take over all of Edgewood piece by piece. Jennifer couldn't let that happen. Whether they knew it or not, the town needed a champion, someone to fight for them, someone who knew the enemy, who had experienced their horrors firsthand. Jennifer was that someone. This was about more than just her son. But if she played it right, she would finally bring Thomas home too. Over the following weeks, Jennifer was clawing back her grasp of time and reality and purpose. It wasn't difficult to strike a chord of resistance in Edgewood. Despite the hard times that had befallen the town over the last few years, many residents took great pride in their home and would do anything to protect it. When word got around that the Broad River Invaders were making a play for a council seat, the townspeople, even some who had become accustomed to the others' presence, jumped at the chance to put forward their own candidate for the seat. Not that many of them even knew what a council member did, or controlled, or even meant. But that didn't matter. Only Jennifer had to know. Jennifer and Patrick continued their late-night rendezvous. When she finally told him she'd been approached about running for the council seat, an easy lie, she was surprised about how quickly he welcomed the competition. It seemed to light a fire within him. And their burgeoning friendship, if you could call it that, remained wholly intact. The resistance of Edgewood had one thing going for them in the upcoming special election. They still outnumbered the others 3-1. That was a relief to many of them, but Jennifer never took anything for granted. In no small part because Patrick, too, seemed unbothered by those numbers. She knew the others must have a plan. Still, the election season started as one might expect. Both Jennifer and the others were going door to door trying to persuade anyone they could. The others were often turned away, and Jennifer was almost always invited inside. At home, Richard was pleased to believe his wife was coming back into herself, and Lucy took pride in this greater celebrity. Though, to Jennifer's surprise, she also offered to help, going door to door, printing flyers, even setting up a small fundraiser with her cheerleading squad. Only after a couple of promising weeks, things started to shift. Rather than trying to win the seat outright, the others had adjusted to finding ways to encourage residents not to vote, to leave town altogether, to join their ranks. To Jennifer's horror, their message did seem to be sinking in here or there. Surely the seeds of their early labor and community outreach meeting a more direct approach. The first to move into Broad River was Eliza Fisher, then a young Anthony McAllister, Jimmy Farah, Connor Smith. Even Alexandra Faison disappeared inside the gates with her newborn daughter. Slowly but surely, the resistance's solid electoral footing seemed to be slipping. Still, as Jennifer and Patrick continued to grow closer, he often inferred that Cecilia Torrey wasn't worried about the outcome of the election. "The town council is small potatoes, Jen," he admitted one night after his third beer. "Cecilia, that is to say, we, have our sights set bigger. When that's the case, when one stepping stone breaks on your way, you find another way up." Unfortunately for Cecilia, Patrick, and the others, the impending election wasn't the only form of resistance springing forth from an increasingly desperate town. Only a few nights later, some locals tried to break into Broad River. They failed, meeting armed resistance. And when Sheriff Clemens was begrudgingly forced to arrest them, he thought they were lucky to still be alive. He asked them why they took that risk. Brian Faison was the one to step forward. He wanted his wife back, and he wanted to stop them from taking anyone else. Jennifer went to visit him in Holding the next morning. The following week, a fire erupted at the others' Villa Street house in the middle of the night. Awoken by the sudden blaze, Jennifer found herself rushing down the block. She beat first responders, unsure if they were in any rush to arrive themselves. With that in mind, betraying her initial instinct, Jennifer rushed inside the burning building to save her friend, Patrick. When she emerged with him by her side a few minutes later, several neighbors and firefighters seemed completely flabbergasted by her apparent heroism. Patrick thanked her for her help. For a moment, in the backdrop of firefighters putting out the fire behind them, it felt to Jennifer that it was just them two, standing in the night alone. He wanted to kiss her. A part of her wanted to kiss him back, which simultaneously brought back that feeling of nausea she'd experienced when they'd first met. The world crashed back only moments later. Patrick went one way. Jennifer went the other. Neither appeared to notice that they were being watched by Cecilia and Richard, respectively. Later that night, or earlier that morning, Jennifer finally admitted to her husband that she had befriended Patrick. She reassured Richard that this was all in an effort to find their son, though how much that actually placated his anger and frustration left much to be desired. In the end, Jennifer didn't care. She'd done what she could to convince Richard, but his support was immaterial. Patrick owed her his life. That was the victory she needed. Word got around about Jennifer saving one of the others, and with it, rumors started to spread. Townspeople had, at that point, seen them together at the Midtown over many nights. Some thought they were, indeed, having an affair. Some thought Jennifer had been persuaded to the other side. Still, a few believed Jennifer to be selfless in saving the enemy, and only liked her more for it. Jennifer did her best to assuage any worry. She remained undeterred in her mission. The only thing that gave her any pause was when Cecilia showed up at the local coffee house a few mornings later, flanked by her guards, and sat across from Jennifer at her table. Caught completely off guard, Jennifer thought momentarily of making a run for it. An instinct she stamped down as she hardened her face to the woman seated before her. Cecilia just smiled, and after a few common pleasantries, made her meaning known. She wanted Jennifer to come into Broad River to see what it's all about. Why? Jennifer couldn't help but ask. Because, Cecilia offered, pausing to sip from her coffee. It's clear you care about this town. So do I. It's my home now, after all. Jennifer swallowed down a scoff. Cecilia pressed on, undeterred. I believe you're going to win the council seat, and I want you to see how we might be a positive part of this community moving forward. You're interlopers, Jennifer said with surprising confidence, preying on a town that was dying before we arrived, Cecilia interrupted. Have you ever wondered where you all might be had we not come? Every day, Jennifer asserted. Very well, I shall take my leave. Cecilia stood up with an unwavering smile. Where is Patrick? Jennifer hadn't seen him in some days now. There was a part of her that was worried about him, though she would never admit that. Come by Broad River tomorrow morning, and I'll show you to him myself. With that, Cecilia departed. Much of the rest of Jennifer's day was dedicated to convincing her family that going into Broad River was the right thing to do. Richard fought her first, but Lucy perhaps fought her hardest. She pleaded with her mother to reconsider. Broad River was dangerous. What if you never come back? She cried. Jennifer couldn't be swayed. This was the closest she'd ever felt to finding Thomas. Everything she'd worked for, the election, had been leading to this. She was succeeding. The others wouldn't dare try to keep her in Broad River now. Still, with Lucy's worry sinking in, Jennifer decided to grab the gun from Richard's lockbox. She would tuck it into her jeans before she left, just to be safe. And so, the next morning, Jennifer arrived at the front gate. Cecilia greeted her as expected and guided her onto the grounds. Everything had progressed in the time since Richard had last been inside. Even without his help, they had done a surprisingly sophisticated amount to make it a livable and sustainable space. Under different circumstances, Jennifer might even have been amazed. They walked slowly. Jennifer tried to hide her fear under a hard exterior, but her body was betraying her in more ways than one. Her palms were sweaty, her voice was shaky, and she kept having to stretch uncomfortably, shifting this way and that in any attempt to find evidence of her son's whereabouts. Cecilia seemed to pay none of it any mind. She simply guided Jennifer forward, telling her about their sustainability practices, their community, their gatherings. She showed Jennifer into their art room, their yoga studio, their self-contained market. On and on Cecilia went until finally Jennifer found the courage to interrupt her. I thought I'd be seeing... She stopped herself, saying Thomas. Patrick. She did want to see him, though he was not her priority. Cecilia smiled. Very well, then. She nodded to one of her guards who disappeared down a dark corridor. Let us meet him in the greenhouse. Jennifer thought that a strange place to meet, but she didn't dare argue after getting her way. Cecilia guided her along. Once inside the glass enclosure, she dismissed her guards. Jennifer didn't notice when they locked the door behind them. She moved around the space, taking in the beautiful greenery. The Japanese have a practice called forest bathing, a new science, of course, but the idea is that there are many health and wellness benefits to being in nature. This way, please. Cecilia guided Jennifer to the far side of the room, out of which she could see directly to a side entrance to the school. "He'll be coming out through that door any moment," Cecilia noted softly. Jennifer stood firm in place as a tense aura filled the room. It could have been seconds, minutes, even hours. She didn't know, because all sense seemed to fall away from her when she saw him escorted outside by 2 guards. Thomas. A gasp escaped her, and she felt as though she couldn't breathe any air back in. The way Thomas squinted, it looked like he hadn't seen the sun in days. He was paler than when she last saw him, skinnier too. "What have you done to him?" Jennifer asked, not taking her eyes off of her son as he was guided along the side of the school. "I'm not sure what you mean," Cecilia answered calmly. Jennifer ignored her. "Thomas!" she screamed suddenly, banging on the glass. "Thomas! Thomas, it's me! Please, Thomas!" Thomas stopped abruptly. Finally, having heard and processed the commotion, he turned on his heels, facing the greenhouse, shocked. For a few moments, mother and son were both frozen in place. He stared at her. She stared back. Then one of his escorts took him gently by the arm, edging him onward. Instinctually, Thomas yanked his arm away. In the next moment, he looked as though he were going to take a step toward the greenhouse. But when the escort grabbed his arm again, that willingness died away. Thomas swallowed hard, turned from his mother, and continued out onto the grounds. Jennifer slammed her fist against the glass, trying to crack it. Then she rounded on Cecilia. "Let me speak to him," she demanded. "That is not what he needs, Jennifer. I'm sorry." "You!" A fire was burning up inside her. "How dare you tell me what my son needs, you bitch!" Jennifer edged forward. At once, the guards outside the greenhouse door made a move to re-enter, but Cecilia held her hands to stop them. She was not afraid, and yet Jennifer noticed something she hadn't before. Cecilia's dog, Otis, had prowled out of the shadows, taking a position down the aisle from them and baring his teeth, growling softly. Jennifer straightened up. Thomas needs his family. He needs his home. He needs to leave. He has always been free to go, Jennifer, and yet he stays. You've brainwashed him. We showed him there was a different way to live, much like I showed you today, and he embraced it, just as the town will when the time comes. Jennifer was at a loss for words, so she slapped Cecilia across the face. Then, as Cecilia recoiled, Jennifer pulled the gun from her jean strap, pointing it at her. There was no stopping now. Otis moved forward, positioning himself between Jennifer and his master. The guards re-entered and were swooping down on Jennifer with a quickness. Nevertheless, Jennifer couldn't bring herself to pull the trigger. She didn't have it in her. Instead, she screamed as the guards took her by the arms, dragging her from the greenhouse. Behind her, over the screams, Cecilia could be heard calling back to her, tracking several paces behind. I wanted to show you our way, Jennifer, so that you might see what we can bring to Edgewood, what we will bring to the town. Join us in that mission, in that good, Jennifer. Together we can accomplish so much. Do you hear me, Jennifer? Together we can rebuild Edgewood, just as we rebuilt Broad River. Cecilia stopped at the door of the greenhouse, watching patiently as Jennifer was dragged across the property, kicking, screaming, and calling out for her son. She remained rooted in that place until Jennifer and her gun had been tossed out front, the gate pulled closed behind her. Then Cecilia Torrey continued about her day. Jennifer Howell spent the last few days of her election in agony. In her stead, Richard and Lucy had taken up final preparations for voting day. They also took turns sitting with Jennifer, reassuring her and trying to pull her out of her depression. "You're going to win," Lucy kept telling her. "Your plan is still intact," Richard would add. But Jennifer felt broken. She had taken Cecilia's words to heart, internalized them, and realized that she hadn't done enough for her son. The family hadn't done enough for him. It was their fault, not the others, that he'd gone. And now she feared it was far too late. It was the morning of Election Day. Jennifer's victory party was being prepared, though she didn't care. In one final plea, Richard came to sit with her in their room. He was not himself in that moment. He was softer than he'd been in years, kinder, more thoughtful. Richard told Jennifer just how sorry he was, how much he wanted to change for her, how much Lucy had been fighting for their family, and how far she could go as she grew up with their help. "The way you fought these last few months," he finished, "I didn't understand it at first, but I do now. It's given me hope that we can build something new for Edgewood and for our family. But you have to keep fighting, Jen. We have to keep fighting together." The word rang hollow in her ears. Together, together, together. Jennifer Howell spent the next few hours still sitting in her bedroom by the window, staring out as if she could see past all the trees and houses and people right to Broad River. She thought about Thomas's childhood, everything she could remember, and everything she couldn't. Then about the day he left, about the way her husband had abused him, the way Lucy had ignored him, and the way she, Jennifer, had let them, all the while only praying for something to change. A prayer that had been answered, though not in any way she'd hoped. By the time Jennifer made her decision to get up from the chair, there were just a few hours left to go before she was due on Main Street to await the election results. Her family was already there. She was alone in the house. She walked her garden, picking weeds. She cleaned the kitchen. She got dressed, then moved into Thomas's room, where she rested on his bed. She picked up an old Lego set from the bedside table, smiling at it in her hand. Then she took a deep breath, knowing it was time. And that's when the doorbell rang. It was only a matter of hours before Richard and Lucy Howell returned home that night. They'd paid their respects to everyone who had attended Jennifer's victory party, thanked those who helped bring about that victory, and apologized for her absence, which they attributed to her feeling under the weather. As they entered the house, Richard fully expected to find his wife in their room, still sitting in her chair by the window. He did, indeed, find her there, with a gunshot wound to the head, the family's gun lying on the floor next to her, and the Lego set she'd taken from Thomas's room resting on the windowsill. It was another hour later. The house was surrounded by police and nosy neighbors, and even somewhere in the distance, Cecilia, Torrey, and Otis, without their usual guard. Lucy cried at the kitchen table where a female paramedic, her mother's friend Ashley, held her hand and tried to console her in any futile way she could. On the front steps, Richard was altogether numb of his senses as he explained for the third time about Jennifer's final week, the morning of the election, and what he'd come home to find. Another hour. Richard was dismissed. He took Ashley's place at the kitchen table, asking for privacy with his daughter. He held her hand for a while, shared in her tears, then took a resounding breath, lifting Lucy's head to face his. His mouth quivered as he looked into her eyes, deeper than he ever had before. He found the determination he sought in them. We have to fight now, Lucy. Together." Lucy nodded, an angry determination swelling behind her puffy red eyes. Another few hours. The sun was starting to rise. The police had taken Jennifer's body. The onlookers had returned to their homes. Richard sat on the couch, blankly watching old episodes of Hollywood Squares while Lucy slept against his shoulder. They would need to fight. He knew that. Not just because Patrick would reemerge and continue, albeit by all reports half-heartedly, pursuing the vacant city council seat. Not just because Jeff Robinson, the owner of Ainsworth, would disappear into Broad River and sign ownership of the store over to Cecilia Torrey. Not even just because the others would next be pursuing the purchase of the old factory some miles down Robertson for yet unknown reasons. They would need to fight because they owed that to Jennifer and to knock, knock, knock. They would need to fight, but for now, they needed rest and time to mourn. Knock, knock, knock. The second rapping against the door woke Lucy, who leaned up from her father. "They'll go away," he whispered. Richard checked the clock on the wall. It was 5:42 a.m. Instead of leaning back down, Lucy simply stared forward. Knock, knock, knock. It was unavoidable. Richard stood. Lucy turned as he approached the door. Both were caught by utter shock when he opened it to find Thomas Howell had returned home.
This has been Unlike-Minded, a sci-fi audio anthology. Collection 4, Among Us. Stories about aliens, skinwalkers, and other invaders. The Others was written by Robbie Hyne and narrated by Brenda Strong. Unlike-Minded is an August year-round production, created, produced, and edited by Robbie Hyne. Our intro and outro music is by Noah James, and our key art is by Brendan Haley. We'd like to give a special thank you to everyone who has supported this independent podcast production. You can keep up to date and find more info about this podcast and others on Instagram at the handle August Year Round Prod, by visiting our website, augustyearround.com, or by emailing us at augustyearround@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to this collection of Unlike-Minded, a sci-fi audio anthology.
The Fable and Folly Network, where fiction producers flourish.